Hello, and welcome to the Just and Sinner podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me on the program once again today. And just a quick reminder that this program and all that we do with Just and Sinner is supported by donors. So we would ask that you consider becoming a contributor. You can go to justandsinner.org and find out how to contribute and donate. We today on the program are joined, it's not just me today, but I am joined by one of the other people who is involved with Just and Sinner. This is Pastor Matthew Fenn, who you may have seen on the program before. He's come on to discuss some other things, and we're going to be discussing an essay that he has written that is part of our new published book, The Doctrine of Justification. And I have my not for resale copy, so it doesn't look as nice, but yours will not have that if you order a copy. But Pastor Fenn, thanks for being on again today.
Hey, thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure to come on the show.
Yeah, and there's all sorts of stuff we want to talk about in the future too. And maybe at some point we'll do something more specifically just on St. Anselm. But I think we're going to be touching on Anselm a little bit today. A little bit today, because it does relate to the Doctrine of Justification as we're talking about it in Paul's letter to the Romans specifically. If you're not familiar with this book, though, this is called The Doctrine of Justification, Theological Essays from the Weidner Institute. This is part of a new series that we are doing. Pastor Fenn is my co-editor with me of this whole series. So this is the first volume. We've decided to start with justification because we're Lutherans and it only makes sense to do justification first, right? So we've got upcoming volumes that are being put together currently on sanctification and the attributes of God and providence and predestination. So those are all currently in the works.
And according to standard Lutheran procedure, we'll make sure that the sanctification volume is the weakest.
Oh, of course. Yeah. We've actually got some great essays in there. We have an essay from Joel Bierman and Leopoldo Sanchez in there that are very good. And I've got a critique of Gerhard Ferde because that's what I have to do, right?
Absolutely.
That's what I do in this book. It's all my essays. It's just critiques of Gerhard Ferde on every topic. Hopefully there's something a little more valuable than just that. But with that, this is the final essay in this volume. And the title of this essay, again, you can go to jspublishing.org. You can look it up on Amazon if you want to order a copy yourself. And we would recommend that you do that, of course. And by the way, I forgot to actually give you officially an intro. So Pastor Matthew Fenn he's part of the board of directors for Just and Sinner. If you're not familiar with him, he's a pastor in the Lutheran Church of Canada. So he's the pastor of St. Peter's Evangelical Lutheran Church in Stratford, Ontario. And if you are in the area, you can go or invite him to go to Tim Hortons with you or something.
Yeah, that's right.
So this essay, Defending God's Honor, the Righteousness of God in Light of Honor and Shame, is the final essay in this volume. It's also the longest essay in this volume. I think David J. Weber's is pretty close on objective justification, but it is still the longest essay in here. And this is very, very much an exegetical essay dealing with the concept of honor and shame and how this relates to righteousness, and then consequently, of course, how it relates to the doctrine of justification. So if you're familiar with the history of specifically medieval theology, and you think about the concept of honor, the figure that you usually associate with that is Anselm. So this is going to relate some to Anselm's theology, but then we're really going to be spending the time, I think, talking about how this relates to Paul's theology. So there are a couple of kind of figures that I think are looming behind this essay that maybe we can get into first and just kind of say who they are, what their importance is. And those would be the medieval Anselm and then a modern theologian, N.T. Wright. So if we could maybe start with both of those and tell us like who they are, why they're important to this conversation, and then what relevance that has to your essay.
Sure. Let's start with St. Anselm. Anselm of Canterbury was the Archbishop of Canterbury and also a Benedictine abbot, I believe. And he lived, I'm forgetting the dates, right around 1100-ish in that ballpark. He wrote a whole bunch of works. He's most famous for two of his works. He's most famous for Cur Deus Homo, Why God Became Man, in which Anselm seeks to provide the rationale behind the incarnation. And that essay or book specifically deals with honor and shame. He really picks up on Romans 2 verse 18ish, that sin dishonors God, and so he views Christ's sacrifice as restoring God's honor, and then that becomes the standard the view of the atonement for a while. And even our own Lutheran view of the atonement owes an incredible debt of language to that view, even though we don't follow it every single point, or there's been developments since then. Other works Anselm's known for, which don't feature into my essay particularly, are his monologia and proslogion, where he deals with the ontological argument for the existence of God, which most people will read if they're doing some sort of philosophy of religion course or some such. So Anselm's view of the atonement becomes the standard. It's modified by Aquinas and further modified and elaborated on by the time of the Reformation, and it becomes vicarious satisfaction.
Right. So Anselm is really kind of the key figure, and not just in the medieval period, but he's really the most significant figure since Athanasius to have written on the question of why God became man, like what's the purpose of the atonement. And so Anselm really stands behind pretty much any conversation that we have of Christian soteriology since his time.
Yeah, and it's good to note that Anselm is responding to popular notions of the patristic idea of the ransom theory, that the atonement is a ransom being paid to Satan, and so he's kind of course correcting on that. Yeah.
So Anselm's major critique then is a kind of popularized idea that says that Satan has some kind of right over us, and God owes Satan something to get us back. And of course, the scripture does use the language of ransom, but you can't. People kind of ran a little too far, I think, and a little too literalistically with that language, which Anselm is correcting. And then that, also is set up against what you find with people like Peter Abelard when you get the moral influence theory, which also becomes popular in the medieval period and critiqued quite a bit at that time. And Anselm kind of wins the day in the West in both the Protestant Reformation in various branches as well as within Rome. I mean, everybody's really kind of defined by Anselm in some way. Even the East largely is driven by polemics against Anselm in a lot of formulations of the atonement, because everybody's got to deal with Anselm.
And yet you get guys like Darrell Hart, who has a essay. I think it's Darrell Hart. He's the Orthodox guy, right?
No, you're thinking of David Bentley Hart.
David Bentley Hart. Darrell Hart's a Reformed guy. Yes,
I've gotten them confused before too. It's okay.
Too many hearts. But David Bentley Hart has an essay on Anselm called "A Gift Exceeding Every Debt," in which he tries to use and redeem Anselm and present him as a positive figure from an Orthodox perspective. Sure. So Anselm does have his fanboys in the Orthodox community too.
Yeah, I've actually seen, and this maybe is getting far off topic, but I've seen a bit. Topic. Yeah, I know, but that's fine. I have seen a bit of work from some Orthodox theologians more recently, trying to say, hey, we don't have to actually get rid of all of the satisfaction language, and trying to find it in the East as well. So there is a place for that. But the point is, Anselm is he's a really important figure behind all of this, and particularly though he speaks a lot about honor, right? And the atonement is restoring God's honor.
Yeah, that's the key for this. The key idea here coming out of this into my essay is the idea that Anselm, you'll get this objection. That's the word. You'll get this objection to Anselm in a lot of essays. I mean, any cursory, if somebody's giving you an overview of Anselm, you're going to find, you read 3 or 4 and you will find this objection. Anselm is being feudal. When Anselm understands the doctrine of the atonement in terms of honor and shame, he's thinking of God as a feudal lord, and he's thinking of medieval law. Some people will use that as a dig and say, see, this isn't biblical. He's not thinking exegetically. He's just thinking in terms of God's Lord. And others will try to be more gracious and say, well, he's contemporizing, he's taking what the Bible says and he's placing it into their context and trying to explain this in a way that they're going to understand. And so I was really struck by that objection, especially considering that in Romans, the language of honor and shame come up all over the place. And through some of my other studies, it seemed to me that accusation is a bit premature. And it seems right on the surface, but if you do a little digging, I think that accusation is wrong. So that accusation is kind of an impetus behind the essay.
Yeah, and I think that that accusation is, that's how I learned Anselm. That's how I learned Anselm in undergrad and in seminary. That was just kind of the standard. That is the standard way of teaching, right? Is that he's using the feudal system, and that's kind of it. So, and the implication, of course, is that he's reading Paul acontextually. Even though most people, will acknowledge in the West that there's certainly something scriptural about what he's saying as well. And it's in some ways it's kind of similar to a lot of the criticisms you'll hear about Luther as well, where his insights into, say, Galatians and Romans are just kind of thrown out as just a product of the medieval debates and the medieval context in which he lived. So it's similar in some ways when you're looking at Anselm. Now, obviously, anyone's historical context is going to affect their interpretation and explanation. That's without a doubt. But what I think you do really well is show that, but there is, like, a lot of these ideas that show up in Anselm are really clearly present within a Roman context as well.
Right.
And I think you've done well in kind of going beyond the literature that is just focused on the Middle Ages or just exegesis, and actually going back and saying, well, what's going on sociologically at this time? And what do scholars in those fields, how have they described what's going on in Romans? So, or not in Romans particularly, but at the time of the writing of the book of Romans. So let's, I want to delve into the specifics, but I think we do have to address kind of the other major figure who is cited some and kind of stands, again, it's not like there's a ton of citation here, but I know that he's kind of looming behind a lot of these debates, and that is N.T. Wright. Right. So
I cite N.T. Wright probably more than anybody else in the essay, because he in the exegetical section, his commentary, his and Dunn's commentary keep popping up all over the place. Sure. So there's lots of, so N.T. Wright is
more just that it's not a huge variety of Wright's works, right? It's mostly
just his commentary on Romans.
Yeah.
Now N.T. Wright is currently the research fellow, I believe, at Oxford. He formerly from St. Andrews, former Bishop of Durham. He has written a whole ton of stuff on Paul's work. He's got Paul and the Faithfulness of God. His big monumental work is the Christian Origins series.
Right.
And he's got 3 or 4 volumes, and he's doing some more. He just released another a full scholarly commentary on Galatians just this past summer, which I haven't gotten into yet. He's got podcasts and popular works. He's very popular. He's very erudite and very. He has a way of breaking complex things down into simple ways to understand it. And so he's very popular because of that. And he's been hugely influential on me because I read a lot of his work. So he stands behind this. And the key idea he has is he's part of this group that's been called the New Perspectives, plural, on Paul. And this comes out of is it Sanders? I think it's Sanders.
Talking about Psychotypal Judaism, that's Sanders' work.
Yeah. So it comes basically in a nutshell as a reevaluation of what Second Temple Judaism is like. We have a lot more of primary sources from Second Temple Judaism that people 500 years ago at the time of the Reformation didn't always have access to. And so we've been able to actually look at Second Temple Judaism from inside their own way of looking at things. And so the new perspective on Paul, it comes as a scholarly appropriation of all that literature to New Testament studies. And it basically says, whereas the Reformation view, to put it very either or, the Reformation view would say, well, the Jews thought that they were earning their salvation by works. And the new perspectives on Paul would say, well, no, they did not think they were earning their way into heaven by works. They thought that they were in the covenant by grace and maintained their status in that covenant by good works. Covenantal nomism, it's called. And so this has basically led to a rereading of Paul that has irked some who hold the traditional Lutheran perspective. And there's been some good defenders: Stephen Westerholm, Charles Lee Irons. There's been some good defenders of, and some of them in the Reformed camp have tried to do the same. Have tried to respond to some of their works and their ideas. But the key idea that of Wright's that stands out for this essay, because this essay was my bachelor dissertation. You have to narrow it down to one thing, and so it comes in that famous verse in Romans 1:16 and 17. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God, tikaiosune theou, the righteousness of God is revealed through faith, for faith, as it is written, he who's through faith is righteous shall live. That's the Revised Standard Version. So it's that phrase, the righteousness of God, which N.T. Wright translates in his commentaries and in his own translation, the New Testament for Everyone, as covenant faithfulness, God's covenant faithfulness to his own covenant.
Yeah, and that issue of the righteousness of God is going to be a big point of debate, and that debate is very much ongoing. I know you mentioned Lee Irons, who has kind of written the definitive defense of the other position.
Yeah, So I cite him once in the book, and a journal article review that I think puts blows a big hole in some of what he's trying to say.
For the record, in the intro to this volume, I mentioned that the two of us disagree on this point. So I'm convinced of Irons' argument.
That's okay. Well, and see, that is actually a major goal of the essay. The goal of the essay is to say, now, okay, so let's take a step back. The righteousness of God by Luther, as we all know, Luther thought the righteousness, he had heard in the scholastic setting that the righteousness of God was God's own righteousness, right, whereby he judges the some and doesn't judge others. And that scared literally the hell out of him. And he has the breakthrough moment where he understands that righteousness here is the righteousness not that God has, but the righteousness that is from God. It's the righteousness that we have given to us as a gift. Hence why this is important for the doctrine of justification.
Sure. And I think what you are trying to show, though, is that, if one accepts the view of the righteousness of God, right? That righteousness is covenant faithfulness. The question is then, does that mean that the Lutheran Reformation is wrong, right? Does a difference on that question, and this is why, standing here, the two of us as, Lutheran pastors and part of the same organization can say, we maybe disagree on this definition of the righteousness of God. But on the other hand, if I'm wrong, and I very well could be wrong on my interpretation of this as well, I think what you do is demonstrate very well that a Lutheran doctrine of justification is not solely dependent upon that particular definition of the righteousness.
Right. And this is so important because N.T. Wright will be just slandered for not believing the doctrine of justification correctly. But if you read enough of his work and you ask him, he will say, no, this is not the text for that. There is a text for that. He says it's Philippians, because in Philippians 2, it talks about a righteousness ek to theou, out of God, from God.
Right.
And he says, see, here it is. Here's the status from God. You actually do have a righteous status from God. And T. Wright will say it does. He just doesn't go to Romans to get it. He goes over to, he picks a different sedes. So a lot of times with N.T. Wright, and with a lot of these guys, James Dunn explicitly in an article says, I believe the Reformation doctrine of justification, absolutely, and all of my work has never been to undo that. So they, the point though is they have different sedeses, they have different primary passages that they go to for these, and they build them in a different way than we have traditionally done. And that's where some of the argument goes. But also I should note that the way my essay defines the righteousness of God, it's important to see that it ends up at the same place.
Right.
So, and that is I would say the righteousness of God is that quality in God, which out of faithfulness to his covenants moves him to save sinners.
Right. And I think there are places in Luther, I mean, I know this obviously isn't, a work in Luther studies, but there are places in Luther, particularly when he's giving lectures on the Psalms, where he seems to define righteousness in that way, at least at times.
Yeah, because, well, the Psalms is especially the Zedek Yahweh in the Psalms,
right,
is this God moving and acting in behalf of the poor and the oppressed and his exiles. Right. And that language gets picked up in Isaiah, and it gets applied to the return from the exile, and then gets turned into eschatological language. And so the New Testament's picking up all this stuff and it's using it. And so that's why I say that N.T. Wright's not quite right to just say it's God's covenant faithfulness, that God keeps his promises. It's more than that. It's because it's the fact that he has made a promise to save humanity, and he will keep that promise. And he will go to the mat for that promise. And that's why it ends up in the same place, because fundamentally it's not about what you do. Paul's answer is no, God out of fulfillment to all his promises sent Jesus. And that's why normally with that righteousness of God, you have the alternate understanding of the pistis Christou in chapter 3.
The faithfulness of Christ versus faith in Christ.
Yes. The righteousness of God through either faith in Christ or the faith of Christ. Those playing the home game in Greek, it can be either way. You just have to make a choice.
Yeah, this is a major debate in New Testament studies.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are solid exegetical points on either side. But even if you translate it that way, notice the next phrase: the righteousness of God through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ for all who believe.
Right.
That's for me. That's the major point. This phrase has to be faithfulness of Christ, because then he references faith. Otherwise, in my ears, it's tautological. He's saying the same thing exactly over again, which doesn't seem to make complete sense to me, but others come up with a way around that, and that's fine. But think about it though. God, out of faithfulness to his covenants, promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and David, and all the patriarchs, sends his son, and his son, through his own faithfulness, is the source of your salvation if you believe in him. Jesus, and that's what we're, getting to what we were talking about before we started recording, and your essay in the book, the act of obedience of Christ. This is where that act of obedience of Christ comes in. We're saved not by our own faithfulness, but by the faithfulness of Jesus.
Sure. Yeah. So it those kind of exegetical decisions, particularly with those are probably the two biggest, right? The righteousness of God, the pistis Christi, which is the debate is whether it's an objective or subjective genitive, is the the grammatical thing that's going on there. But I think the point that you do make well is, regardless of what position you take on those texts, it doesn't negate the central point of the Reformation teaching on justification.
That's right.
And I think that what you bring out well is this idea that it's the salvation, it's God's covenant faithfulness for the salvation of sinners, which I think is where the New Perspective goes wrong, at least in the early works.
Yeah,
I think Wright's changed a bit since, but at least in what St. Paul really said, he's got that line that's often quoted where he says justification is not so much about soteriology as it is ecclesiology, not so much about salvation as it is about the church. Where it does seem that there's a real downplaying of the kind of soteriological import of justification.
And see, I've read enough of him to know what he means by that, and what he means by that is that if you look at Romans 3, and the big justification passage, right? In verse 28, the pericope always stops at verse 28. For we hold that a man is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. Next sentence, or is God the God of the Jews only?
Right.
And N.T. Wright will hammer that home, day in, day out.
He does.
And so his point, it's not so much about soteriology, is about ecclesiology. To read him charitably there would be to say what he's trying to get across is that the doctrine of justification is formulated in the hotbed of a controversy surrounding ecclesiology. Who is in the church and who is out? Who gets to come in? Do you need to have circumcision to come in? Do you need to have the works of the law to come in? Those boundary markers, circumcision, Sabbath keeping, and dietary restrictions. Right. Do you need to keep all those external things to come in? And justification is here in Romans is being explicitly connected to that debate. Or is God the God of the Jews only? And I think if we're reading him charitably, that's likely what he's trying to get at, that this is an ecclesiastical document. This is about, in his words, who's in the church and who's not in the church.
I just think in a lot of the literature, I think this is especially true in some of the earlier writings, because I think that especially Wright has, I think he's been a lot more careful and clear to explain things than he was at the beginning, which makes sense. I mean, that's kind of how anybody should be, especially as something, people write enough books against a perspective. That's
probably likely the case. His big book that he released last year before, with Michael Bird, is the New Testament in its world. Michael Bird wrote an essay where he critiqued Wright, and the New Perspective on Paul, and because he's Reformed Anglican, and he has an essay where he lists the areas where they're wrong. Well, they worked together to publish this book. So obviously, as the debate raged, a while ago about his work, that he's been able to refocus what he says, even so much that guys like Michael Horton now endorse his books regularly.
That is kind of a surprising thing. I think if you want a summary of Lee Irons' argument I think Horton does a really good job at presenting that argument in his justification volume as well. If you want to, Horton's justification 2 volumes, I think, are excellent at giving a good overview of what some of those contemporary debates are. Yeah, and I think Bird is known as a figure who's kind of a mediating figure in a lot of ways. And I think you're doing something similar with this, is to say there are some genuine insights. There are some places where interpreters maybe haven't understood certain things in Paul's context that guys like Wright are really pointing out. But this is not to say that the Reformation is wrong.
That's right. A lot of times, a lot of times you can see this exact thing, this exact type of thing, I should say, happen when a pastor sits down with his text for the week, because pastors have oodles of time to actually do that, right? But what on those rare occasions where a pastor actually gets to sit down and actually look at the text before he starts to prep on it, instead of reaching back into his seminary training, and you look at those footnotes and you look, you're in your Nestle Island or whatever, and you see there's a variant, and you see there's 2 variants, they have equal weight, and they say 2 slightly different things. And what do? Well, you take the time and you parse it. Okay, if this variant is correct, here's how the text reads. How does that mean? What does that mean? And then you parse it, and you come out with something that sounds reasonably theologically sound and makes sense with the context and all that stuff. And you do the same thing with the other one. And that's why I really think that everybody comes to the text with theological assumptions. And of course, those theological assumptions sometimes control how we view the data. So sometimes when you're reading exegetical guys, especially the New Perspective or people you don't agree with, oftentimes it's not so much that their exegesis is wrong. It's the theological conclusions they're drawing from said exegesis are wrong. You know what I'm saying? They're another example from Wright is in his book, The Day the Revolution Began. He has this great little section talking about the concept of God's presence. And he goes and talks about the temple, and he talks about, the Shekinah glory and the cloud. And he goes all the way through into Jesus as being, the presence of God. And he brushes up against communion and then stops. And then we'll deny the Lutheran position elsewhere. But he has no theological ground to do it, because all of the right. So something similar happens, I think, in their works, where if you read just the exegetical details, I think this is an objective genitive instead of a subjective genitive. Okay. I thought all Lutherans are all about God keeping his promises. I thought that's like our bread and butter all day long. How is that not? How can we not make that work? Of course, God keeps his promises, right? And so that was a big force behind this work. And to segue, in order to get that done, to look at that, I decided to look at Romans 1-3 in light of honor and shame, because I thought a different approach to the text and the one approach that the New Perspective is not using is the approach called social scientific criticism. Right. And there's the standard textbook is I forget the name of it now, but it's by a guy named Bruce Molina. New Testament in something or other. I'm terrible. Anyway,
New Testament World is the summary title in the footnotes.
That's the one, New Testament World, and the other one is by De Silva, Honor, Patronage, Kinship, and Purity. Those 2 books do a fantastic job at summarizing lots and lots of social studies info as it relates to the New Testament. And that's important, because not only do you have to translate the text, you also have to translate the culture, and you have to actually look at how would this have been understood in their culture. And we know a heck of a lot about Roman culture. because, you know, classics are a thing.
Sure, yeah. And I think sorry, just to get back to Wright just real quick. I think the thing that I have found maybe most frustrating in reading Wright is that what I see is he pays so much attention, particularly to the Jewish context of the New Testament, and has so many good insights there. But there's so much about the Roman context or the Greek philosophical context that I feel like is often missing from his treatment. Right. And I feel like that's what you're kind of doing with this kind of criticism and bringing that in, to say this is an element that guys like Wright or Dunn are really missing, that do help to fill in the picture as well of what Paul's talking about.
Right. And I mean, at seminary, we had to read Wright in the Gospels class, Simply Jesus, a fantastic look at the Jewish background to messianic concepts in general. Fantastic. Nothing wrong with the book. Great book. I recommend it to my parishioners who want to read about the Jewish understanding of Jesus and the Messiah and all that stuff. Fantastic little book. And that's exactly, and so, yeah, but the idea though is that you can see, you could have missed it. I mean, how many times have we read that Romans 1 passage and missed it? I am not what? Ashamed. Why is Paul ashamed? What does it mean for Paul to be ashamed? Why? See, there's a question there, and we don't live in an honor and shame culture. But the connection here is Anselm did, and the first century Roman world was very much honor and shame based. In fact, one of my articles that I read for this essay said honor and shame language is more prevalent and in Romans than justification language, and it's throughout the epistle from beginning to end. And it's right here in the thesis statement of the book. He's not ashamed of the gospel. So that means that in the Roman world, some people would hear the gospel and think that they would have reason to be ashamed of that. It would not bring them honor. And so there's a connection here. And so then in chapter 2, when he starts talking about sin, he says the name. He says, he says that sin dishonors God. See he's using Paul. This isn't Saint Anselm making this move. This is Paul saying that our sin dishonors God, and that the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles.
Right.
Or in Romans 3, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory. This isn't just a Jewish understanding of God being shiny or something. This is glory that's a loaded word in the Roman world. Right. It implies something. And so when you look at those first 3 chapters, and specifically his argument as he goes through, you start to see that what he's talking about intimately relates to God's honor, God needing to save face, so to speak. God, and God saves face. He shows that he is honorable by living up to his obligations, which is and his obligations are to save fallen humanity. And Jesus does that by restoring to God the honor we took from him.
Right.
And so all of that, and so it ends up sounding quite Anselmic, but I don't cite Anselm to make my point. I'm citing social scientific guys and new perspective guys and this kind of thing.
Yeah. So let's maybe kind of break that down and look at, because you put forth a really good case. There were all of these texts that talk about honor and shame, and especially when you point out that that's even more prevalent than justification language, and that it extends throughout the book, even in a way that justification language doesn't. Clearly, this is an important theme in Paul, and I think, I read a lot on literature surrounding the book of Romans and justification, and I can say that this is one of those themes that really is not that it's never discussed, but it certainly is never the center of any conversation. Like never.
Yeah.
So that's what's so interesting about this, is that you really are pulling out something and saying, hey, this is a major theme in Paul, and all of the discussions are going on in justification. This is something that really isn't present at all. So let's kind of take a step back then, because I think you defend this very well. And again, everyone can look at the essay. You'll get more from reading than our brief conversation here. But take a step back and say, what is an honor and shame culture in the first place? So like, we've got that it's there in Paul, we've got that it's in Anselm. So let's go back, and say, what is an honor and shame culture? Because, to be honest, when I think of an honor and shame culture, the first thing I do is think about Klingons and Star Trek. But
great.
My
Kapla.
Exactly. Yeah, what is this, in real life, besides the Klingons? Even though, of course, the Klingons are actually based on what are, kind of exaggerated forms of real cultural norms. So what do we define as modern?
So honor, to put it simply, honor is social credit. Honor is social credit. It's a culture where a person sees their own self-worth, their own reputation, their own identity in light of their relationship to the community and how the community views them. So if a person has lived up to their social obligations, they are considered to be honorable. If they are from a house, a family line where people have done great deeds, they get honor. They have a credit. And if you do something shameful, you lose credit. And so you can almost view it as like a credit score, but for relationships with other people. That's honor and shame. And you can, if you can do something or say something to another person that dishonors them, it lowers their reputation in the eyes of the community. And they have this thing where they would challenge each other. And a lot of Jesus's encounters with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the religious leaders are these kinds of things. The Pharisees are trying to one up Jesus, but not just because they have this notion of beating him, but because there's a crowd there and they want the honor from beating. They want the social credit, and they want Jesus to drop a few bars for the social credit. And that's what Jesus says to them. I honor God, but you dishonor me, right? And in John chapter 5. So that's honor and shame in a very basic nutshell.
So you're pointing out that this is beyond, right, the book of Romans. I mean, obviously that's where you're focusing on this essay, but you're saying this is a pretty consistent theme in the New Testament as a whole.
Oh yeah, no, because it's you might even say it's a consistent theme in the Bible, because the ancient world the ancient Near East was also an honor and shame type culture, and so I think this is probably a biblical theme that you could probably tease out here and there throughout the Bible.
Yeah, it seems like most cultures probably have these assumptions. I mean, around the world today, many still do. I think some of it is probably Western individualism, that we don't think in terms of our collective status, or we're not oriented in that way today, which certainly would cause us to, I think, miss some of those key.
Yeah, and so if the other aspect is, if a person was dishonored, and brought shame upon someone else, they had to fix it. And you had to fix it by making restitution, making up for it. You needed to restore the honor that you had restored, that you had taken or hurt for. And that, remember, involves a social credit, social standing, so to speak. And the act of restoring someone's honor is called making satisfaction.
Sounds familiar.
So when you're talking about, when Paul says sin dishonors God, it means, and he follows that up by saying the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles. So he's saying that our sin lessens the reputation that God has in the world. When you and we can see this every time there is an abuse scandal in the Roman Church, it lessens people's understanding, their reputation of the Roman Catholic Church.
Right.
And you can see that if they were the only church, people would say, well, I don't want to have anything to do with that God. Right? The name of God becomes blasphemed because of our sin. Our sin dishonors God. It takes something from him, because God deserves to be honored and praised and lauded and worshipped. And so that's so that honor that we have taken from him needs to be restored. And that's what satisfaction is.
Yeah, so I mean that sounds very Anselmian. I think anybody hearing what you're saying is taking a basic church history class or something like that is going to say, "Wow, that just sounds exactly like Anselm."
And that's just basic sociology applied to what the words that Paul's using. I mean, and that's and the other aspect of this is you have the patronage system, where you would have a patron, a wealthy benefactor, and in order to get something, to get ahead, you would ask the patron to do something for you. And so the patron would the patron would provide benefits for you, and in turn you would laud and magnify and increase the social cred of your patron. Sure. And sometimes your patron was too high, so you had somebody, a broker, who came between you and the patron, and that's great. And some of these ideas, our concept of grace, it has its fullness in these kinds of relationships. It can be used to refer to the altruistic disposition of the patron, the benefactor, towards the client. And that's the Lutheran definition. There's your Lutheran definition, the favor Dei propter Christum, the favor of God towards us on account of Christ. That's the first one. It can also refer to the gift that the patron gives to the client. You go to the local lord and ask him for money to help build a wall around your crops, and he gives you the money to build the wall around the crops, and that money is a grace. It's a gift, and that is what Luther calls the donum, right? Grace is both favor and gift, right? So some of this is very familiar to us Lutherans. We just don't. Right. And then grace can also be the act of the gratitude that you have back to the benefactor. And that's all of those are important to see what this honor and shame business is. And you will find this language in some of our reformers too, because the 16th century was more of an honor and shame culture than ours was. So it will pop up, and they will occasionally use this kind of language in reference to God.
So how does this then relate to, because we kind of started this discussion talking about this idea of the righteousness of God and some of the debates surrounding that. So how does this notion of honor and shame then that you've unpacked so far, how does that relate to the righteousness of God in some of those debates?
Dunn notes that helpfully that the righteousness of God is intimately related to his community obligations. And so you should start to see the connection here. God's righteousness, if it's his covenant faithfulness, it's intimately connected with the idea of his honor, because your honor is your ability to keep your social obligations. And God's righteousness is the fact that he is faithful to his social obligations. And so that's the connection here. And a book that I had not read before doing this essay, Fleming Routledge, her great book on the cross, notes, has an excursus about Anselm, and where she notes that honor is righteousness. That's she says it just like that. I wish I would have had that footnote, because I would have put that in and made it front and center. Honor is righteousness. And once you get that, Anselm starts to make sense. Whereas, so the righteousness of God is his honor. It's his ability to keep the obligations that he's put himself under.
I think that's really helpful, just to make some of those connections, so you can see how this whole definition of the righteousness of God, I think, that you have in someone like Wright, is really filled in with this conception of honor tied to it in a way that it isn't just in Wright in his own work. Have you encountered, I'm curious, with all of your reading of Wright, and by the way, I will say that my in my formulation of even the active obedience of Christ that's in this volume, largely the formulation of that was through reading Wright as well. So I think, when I think through, especially the Wright's book, The Climax of the Covenant, where he makes this argument that, he makes this argument, and I'm getting a little bit afield, but he makes this argument that the Jews saw themselves still essentially as in exile in the time of the first century. And I think he's right.
Absolutely correct.
And he says that, the curse that Jesus takes upon himself on the cross is at least in some way the exile. Like this is the curse of the exile that Israel still hasn't fully paid in some way. And that then his resurrection is the restoration of Israel to the land. Like this is the fulfillment of all of these Old Testament promises. And to me, when I really understood that in Climax of the Covenant and reading through Wright's works, to me that ended up becoming the basis for the active obedience of Christ, which was to say that if you understand Jesus as Israel and you understand the covenant obligations that Israel had, it has to flow from that Jesus had to be obedient, like because Israel did, and he is the new Israel. And so part of the redemptive story has to be his faithfulness to the covenant, which means his faithfulness to the divine law. So
that's right, which is why N.T. Wright will translate that phrase, the faithfulness of Jesus. You can see why he would want to say that.
So when you see all that, though, it actually ends up fitting pretty well with like the classical approach, and classical Lutheran approach in particular. And I make the argument that that's actually really where that redemptive historical theme is really where we should, I think, draw more essentially in terms of active obedience than just narrowly focusing on Romans chapter 5, which I take the view that isn't actually about active obedience, but I know that that's certainly a debated text. But nonetheless, the only reason I'm talking about this is to say that, I think you did something very similar with your essay. Yours is much more, in depth in terms of dealing with this, but to say that you don't have to buy into all of the conclusions of where something like the New Perspective has gone if you agree with these certain points, which are really key and good points. And if someone like Wright himself would certainly acknowledge that there are things that are missing from his account. He never claimed that his approach is perfect. But I think what I see, and I'd like to kind of hear your thoughts on this with Anselm, is that someone like Wright and a lot of the New Testament exegetes in general who are involved in this discussion are not great historical theologians, because they're very narrowly focused, makes sense, on the New Testament text and the Jewish context of the New Testament. And it means that oftentimes I see them, because I've dealt with this more in the context of like Luther. And when I read the criticisms of Luther, I just say, this is not Luther. Like what
Right.
the criticism.
My professors once said, when N.T. Wright talks about Luther, just substitute that out for Bultmann, and it's probably correct.
I think that is exactly right. And it makes sense. Bultmann is so huge in New Testament studies that someone like Wright, who's going into New Testament studies, I mean, the Lutheran exegete they encounter is going to be Bultmann. Not as much today as when he was, initially studying, but his Bultmann's ghost is still looming over us in some ways.
It's true, and I mean, N.T. Wright, his undergrad was in classics,
Right.
So when it comes to knowing. His ability to take some of the classical stuff, especially when he's talking about, Epicureanism or Stoicism, and when he's going in Paul's letters and looking for those influences in Paul and that kind of stuff, and then the Jewish background to that, it's fantastic. He's awesome. Oftentimes he gives you the bird's eye view.
Right.
He gives you he's very much a biblical theologian, bird's eye view kind of guy, and you get into the nitty gritty and you get down into the details, and you disagree here, you disagree there, you disagree with that move, but you still, and a lot of times I still end up thinking his overarching biblical understanding, how his redemptive historical understanding, biblical theological understanding, the way he's putting these things together, generally speaking, it's correct. But you're right. I think that when they deal with historical theology or especially church history, it gets more dubious.
Yeah.
The other major part of the essay that is interesting and controversial, which I learned, is my comments on sacrifice. This is I found this very interesting. But in Romans 3, we have that famous word hilasterion.
Yes, an often debated word. Yeah.
Yes. And lutron, lutrosis, redemption. What's often missing here is that these two words, my third favorite subject, I managed to sneak it into this essay too. We often don't see how these words are used in the Septuagint, because that was the Bible of their day. So when you're doing biblical studies, especially in Paul in the New Testament, Paul and Luke especially, and Hebrews, Paul, Luke, and Hebrews are big. You got to check their word usage, if it's a big word, with the Septuagint. And when you do that, and you look at what Hebrew words, though can sometimes that's you can't always do that, because the Hebrew that we have is not always the Hebrew that the Septuagint's translating. So you're hoping that in this case it's the same. In this case, we're pretty sure it is, and that's the Hebrew word for atonement. And what's interesting is that the dictionaries talk about a cultic use, and then a use of this word for atonement that applies to the Levitical sacrifices. But then they talk about a non-cultic use, an interpersonal use. And very few people make the connection between the interpersonal use of these words and the cultic use, except for the fact that the Bible makes the link at least once. And basically, the what's interesting in terms of how this works in the atonement is in Israel, you had to actually pay money for, was it every firstborn? Every firstborn had to pay money, a kofar. It was a kofar, a lutron in the Septuagint, a redemption. You had to pay a price for your life, and you gave the money, and otherwise God was angry with you. And so think of it in this way: in a personal relationship, if you had a bull and your bull came and gored me and I had to chop off my leg, I would have the right to reprisal. Well, you would pay me an amount of money, and we would be good, right? So the Hebrew words for atonement come from referring to either the gift that you give me to make amends, or the resulting personal reconciliation that we have. And that, I think, is very important to see what's going on. And what's interesting is when when the word sacrifice is used in the New Testament, in Romans and in other places, like when it's used in Isaiah 52 as well, 53, in 2 Corinthians 5:21, a very debated verse. God made him, but in both in Romans 8:3 and 2 Corinthians 5:21, and here in Romans 3, the word for sacrifice, if you go back to Isaiah 53, it's a specific word. It's not just sacrifice. It's a specific type of sacrifice. It's the asam, the reparation offering. It's the offering that you pay to God because of some inadvertent sin whereby you have offended him. You have offended God. You need to pay the price. It's the same exact sacrifice. And that's the type of sacrifice that's referenced in Isaiah 53. And that's translated by a specific Greek word, which is then used in the New Testament as the word for sacrifice. All of that to say, this honor and shame stuff is tied in to the Hebrew understanding of the atonement in general. And so we cannot get away from honor and shame as integrally connected to our atonement. And this is something that you don't need to go farther than the Large Catechism, because in the Large Catechism, Jesus, it says that Luther says that Jesus died to pay what I owe. That language is intimate, is deeply biblical.
Right. Yeah, that's very, very interesting. So as we're, we kind of got to wrap up here time wise. So if you're watching this and you're really interested in this topic, I would recommend picking up a copy of the book. I'd recommend picking up a copy of the book anyway, because there are 8 essays in here, hopefully all worth reading. I certainly think so. And yeah, on all different facets of justification. So again, the Doctrine of Justification, Theological Essays from the Weidner Institute. This is the first volume. What is going to be a series on many, many different topics. So Pastor Fenn, why don't you tell us a little bit kind of what you're working on right now, because you're working on a master's thesis that's kind of building some of this out. Obviously, it won't be available for people to read yet because you're writing it, but at some point, I'm sure that hopefully we'll see publication as well. I'd love for us to, as a Weidner Institute, to put out some kind of version of that as well. Sure. So yeah, tell us what you're kind of working on now.
Right now I'm working on looking at Saint Anselm and the Doctrine of the Atonement. I'm looking specifically at contemporary objections to penal substitution, the idea that Jesus was punished in our place, looking at contemporary objections by contemporary theologians, a lot of whom are, your feminist, black, womanist,
Sure.
liberal theologians. N.T. Wright is figuring high on the list again, and others. Weaver's book Nonviolent Atonement, put out by Erdman's, figures very high, and so I'm looking at taking those objections to the atonement as my problem, to penal substitution. I'm then going and looking at Anselm's doctrine of the atonement, specifically looking at when he says satisfaction, he sets up a dilemma. Either you are punished or you make satisfaction. He sets up that dilemma. So I'm going to explore that. Then I'm going to look at the three great reformers, Luther, Melanchthon, and Chemnitz, and look at their doctrines of the atonement. Then we'll jump back into Romans 3 and really open the hood and get underneath that. And then see having looked at Romans 3 using the same methodology I used in this treatise, come out on the other side and see if we can't make an Anselmic Lutheran doctrine of the atonement that is able to avoid the objections offered by contemporary scholars and theologians. So that's what I'm doing. I'm on my first preliminary chapter with all the prolegomena stuff has been approved, and now I'm on to chapter 2.
Yeah, it sounds interesting. I'm glad you're getting a chance to kind of explore and expand in this. And I know you want to eventually, following this you're going to move right into your dissertation, I assume, to your doctoral program and kind of further this. So, and if people want to find you and have kind of questions for you and maybe want to contact you or complain about something you said on this program, where should they find you?
You can find me. You can read you can read my sermons and my weekly stuff at the Keys of St. Peter or St. Peter's. Oh goodness.
You should know this. It's yours.
Well, the church website is the Keys of St. Peter's. Okay. The Keys of St. Peter's, all one word, .com. That's my sermons and Bible studies. My recording of my sermons and Bible studies is up on anchor.fm. I think you can find it on most podcast places, but it's called The Church Door, and a very Lutheran name, by the way. And it's anchor.fm/Rev Fenn. And if you want to email me and complain about me, you can email me at revfen@icloud.com.
Cool. Yeah. And we're currently with Justice Center. We've talked about some kind of sermon podcast as well, kind of between a bunch of us. I don't know what that's going to be like, or if we're doing that, or, eventually we want to put up some online sermon resources as well, whether that's, switching on and off between us, or we just have links to all of our sermons. I don't know. But hopefully there'll be something there as well. I would like to hear comments and questions about that too, because I'm getting some feedback that people would be interested in something like that as well. So, all right. Well, I hope you enjoyed listening and watching. Thank you, Pastor Fenn, for being on with us again. And if you want to see, Pastor Fenn come back and discuss anything that, we kind of touched on. I know we've talked about doing some, additional programs on specifically Anselm. We could do something on the Septuagint Bible translations as well. We've done something on Melanchthon. And those are kind of, I guess, those are your major areas, right, of interest.
Oh yeah, so, those are my areas.
Yeah. If you'd like to see something like that in the future, just let me know, or anything else. Or if you just want to talk about Canada and Tim Hortons, we can do that too.
Tim Hortons, it's consistently mediocre.
Yeah, I'm the same way with Dunkin' Donuts though, because I grew up in Massachusetts, and it doesn't matter that it's mediocre because it's home. So
it's consistent.
Yeah, exactly. It is consistent. Well, thanks so much. And we'll see you next time,
Thanks for
everyone.
having me.
Okay. God bless.